Well, it's the Halloween season, so I've got my fangs in for the first time this year, and I get to talk about Halloween things all I want. I'm not gonna be able to keep these in the whole video because I can't really talk with them in, but they look so good, and I spent so much money on them. Okay, no, we gotta take these out. I'm human again. So, Dracula may not have been the first vampire to grace popular culture, like we cannot forget our lesbian queen Carmilla, but he was certainly the first one to really empower the idea of the vampire as a sexualized figure, of something attractive rather than simply monstrous. But how today's population views vampires and Dracula is not necessarily the same as how the population viewed them back when Bram Stoker published the book. In the Victorian era, Western minds saw the vampire as something to be genuinely feared. To many, it was a threat that could actually take hold of the community if you weren't too careful, or for that matter, faithful to God. But with the rise of mass media, things that used to frighten us have become more caricatures of their former selves. Our fears are a commodity, especially when we know that deep down, the thing that we're afraid of isn't real. At least here in America, it's hard to say that true fear of vampirism is actually a thing anymore. Mainly because the main fears that drove people to fear vampires have either evolved out of existence or been disproven effectively by science, or taken another form altogether. Dracula represents a culmination of Victorian homophobia, xenophobia, racism, inflamed by the growing revolution in medical understanding and the changing face of colonialism. All of this has everything to do with Bram Stoker himself, of course, as the author, and the perfect storm of culture and chaos that led him to write Dracula. Because sometimes the real monster of the story is the author. No, please bear with me. Full disclosure, I can't make a full and complete and honest determination of what Bram Stoker's sexuality really was, because no one can. I mean, first of all, the guy's dead. But queer readings of his life and work are nothing new, and have lots of points that are well worth looking at. The fact that Dracula the book took a creature historically known for being grotesque and frightening, and ended up morphing them into something super sexy instead, is in fact not an accident at all. Well, maybe kind of an accident. You see, when you write a book trying to air out your fraught feelings on homosexuality in the wake of the Oscar Wilde trial, and Oscar Wilde was your buddy, and you're terrified of the consequences of being gay and you don't know how to organize those feelings, well, no matter how big and scary you make the sexy vampire, you still made a big sexy vampire. And everyone's gonna pick up on it. I don't want to just be like, this thing is gay without backing it up, so here we go. If you're unaware of what the Oscar Wilde trial was, here's a quick breakdown. Oscar Wilde was an author and famous dandy. You may know him either as the author of A Picture of Dorian Gray or as the guy who said, "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken," which is on a laminated poster in every 5th grade teacher's classroom. He started a relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, whose dad went public with the info and caused a scene. Wilde escaped to France and sued the man for libel in 1895. Big f***ing mistake. The trials became a huge media circus because homosexuality was a criminal offense in England. Wilde was accused of sodomy and homosexual solicitation, and his lawyers withdrew, so he was arrested and brought on trial. After much arguing back and forth, he was found guilty of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years hard labor. His health went to hell in prison, and he died in Paris 3 years later. There you go. David Skal writes in his book, Something in the Blood, the untold story of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula. Stoker thrived in a male-dominated world in which a pervasive homosociability allowed more intimate male connections to hide in plain sight, at least until the scandal and downfall of Oscar Wilde, when the parameters of male sexuality became culturally electrified. The public became obsessed with the Oscar Wilde trial, to a degree that resulted in the prosecution of gay men spiking more than ever. It was like a morbid fascination. People were disgusted, and the media frenzy made everything worse and worse. Every aspect of male social behavior suddenly had this nervous edge to it. Even in the gay community itself, Wilde became sort of a hated figure for bringing in so much hostile attention. Very frequently, gay men managed to slip under the radar due to the widespread acceptance of something called romantic friendships, which were even encouraged socially. Romantic friendships were utterly devoted and passionate friendships between men and women and women. Women especially were encouraged to engage in romantic friendships. Not because the straights cared much about sapphics, but more like because it was considered to be practice for marriage. These queer relationships were viewed as safe because they didn't inherently upset the social order. Like, yeah, get as romancy with your best friend as you want, as long as you get married eventually and stuff, and definitely don't have sex. In this framework, at Trinity College, Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker became friends. Not really close friends or anything, more like very close acquaintances, like two planets in very tight orbit around each other. They had similar parents, slightly similar upbringings, similar interests and aspirations, and were both the two pursuers in two different love triangles. One vying for the attention of Henry Irving, an actor, and one vying for the attention of a certain Florence Balcombe. Wilde was more interested in her aesthetic beauty, but got distracted by other things too much to really chase her, and Stoker ended up marrying her in a move that ended up becoming an allegedly passionless marriage? Allegedly. Stoker was plagued by poor health as a child, which attached to his psyche in adulthood in the form of his conviction that he's ugly and misshapen, monstrous. He describes his appearance in no flattering terms in his lovelorn letter to Walt Whitman. There are no photos of Bram Stoker smiling, despite there being no shortage of photos of him, even though he was described by friends and family as being a pretty jovial guy. But where Wilde explored the realms of gender and sexuality in his personal and public life, Bram Stoker mostly explored it in his writing. Extensively, too. In 1875, he had a hand in writing the Dublin play Sappho, and a small fragment of a subtly homoerotic writing of his, The Russian Professor, was unearthed not too long ago. Gender twisting and folklore were inextricably entwined in Ireland and most of Western Europe for many decades, as it was tradition for young boys to be dressed in girls' clothing, with even their hair styled in long artificial curls. The reasoning for this, apparently, was to protect the boys from being spirited away by the Fae, because the fairies were only interested in little boys. Interestingly, as David Skal notes, the first recorded use of the word fairy to describe a effeminate gay man was in 1895, the same year as the Oscar Wilde trial. In the years following, the tradition of dressing little boys in girls' clothing was discarded, influenced by the sudden explosion and fear of the fairies that might take the boys away to the Fae realm, where all the logic of society is upside down, never to return. Or perhaps, instead of a fairy, a sly and mysterious foreign count. Bram Stoker never shied away from exploring the boundaries of gender in his work. Many of his female characters fall under the new woman archetype, often depicted as strong-willed, tomboyish, and outspoken, and not in a way that they're shamed for. Even in his later period, when he did shy away from most things society would find dangerous, his 1905 book, The Man, revolves around a female main character named Stephen, who was raised as a son rather than a daughter. An odd coincidence, since Radclyffe Hall's famous 1920s lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, also features a female main character named Stephen, who ends up being butch. Bram Stoker was always a fairly private man, as he expressed to Walt Whitman in his letter that he wrote years prior. But as soon as Oscar Wilde's trial happened, and the Victorian public gained a hostile awareness of homosexuality, Stoker turned in on himself and became more private as ever. We hardly know anything about him after this point. Of course, this could be due to some random reason, or just some sort of long overdue personal evolution, but the timing is way too lined up to not be connected at all, especially since they knew each other and were fairly close. In his fanboyish letter to Walt Whitman, who was gay, Stoker wrote, "You see, I have called you by your name. I have been more candid with you, and have said more about myself to you than I have said to anyone before. Thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind." If he was indeed a closeted queer man, the Oscar Wilde trial would have made very, very clear to him, and any other gay man of the time, what exactly the consequences are for the crime of love and self-expression, especially a man in the public eye for that matter. In this beginning of his silence, he wrote Dracula, using the book as a proxy to air out his fears and the confusion and frustration. And like many gay men of the era, he became outspokenly homophobic. Whether out of internalized strife or simply to cover his tracks, we'll never know. But it's clear that where the character Dracula is representative of many things that Stoker feared, one of which being queerness and its threat to society, Jonathan Harker and his confused attraction to Dracula and his tumultuous imprisonment within the castle are representative of Stoker himself. At the same time, it is this very monstrification of the queer-coded character that allows Bram Stoker, and therefore the reader, to indulge in the fantasy of him. As Noel Carroll writes, their repulsive aspects mask and make possible various sorts of wish fulfillment, notably those of the sexual sort. The apparent seductiveness of Dracula is no misperception. Dracula is enacting a wish. The audience can deny this to her censor by pleading in her own defense that she is horrified by the vampire, but this is really a dodge. The repulsion is the ticket that allows the pleasurable wish fulfillment to be enacted. If any book featuring a queer character hoped to be published in this era, and frankly many eras following it, the character had to be punished in some way, either made to suffer, killed off, or portrayed otherwise as a monster or a villain. Hence why E.M. Forster's Maurice, though written in 1914, was not published until after his death. The gay characters, all but one, got a happy ending. In Radclyffe Hall's The Will of Loneliness, which was published in the 20s, Stephen's story ends with her descending into a horror nightmare of psychological agony, possessed by the tormented ghosts of all the LGBT people who came before her, having given up the one person she loved. But in Dracula, it is that very horror that is used as Stoker's chance to explore a homoerotic allure, while still passing beyond detection of the powers that be, and most audiences for that matter. Obviously this is coming, right? Because we're talking about Britain in the 1800s, so... Dracula starts off by heavy-handedly establishing who exactly is our hero and who is our villain. We have Jonathan Harker, the well-educated English gentleman, and the mysterious Count Dracula, the wealthy Transylvanian. Before Jonathan even meets Dracula, he describes the locals he meets on his travels as... The strangest figures we saw there were the Slovaks, who were more barbarian than the rest. They are, however, I am told, very harmless. It should come as no surprise to anyone who holds even a little bit of knowledge as to the history of colonialism, and especially the British Empire, that Jonathan Harker likely holds some pretty detestable views of the locals, and for that matter, anyone who isn't Western European. Jonathan Harker emphasizes his high education, his beautiful wife Mina, and his dedication to his faith, just in case you were doubting his status as a nice Christian boy. Europe has a particularly long history of viewing Slavic people as an amoebic other. They're a confusing gray zone that Western Europeans have a really hard time wrapping their heads around. This gets even more complicated bringing in the problem of Europe's view on the Roma and the Jewish people, who have long suffered at the hands of their European neighbors for apparently the heinous crime of being a diasporic people of a frequently darker complexion. While Dracula is not depicted as darker necessarily, due to the vampire staples such as the pale skin of a corpse as well as the pale skin of a wealthy man who sees no sun, we have established earlier that Dracula is a symbolic stand-in for Oscar Wilde, he still adopts that very role that the Roma and Jewish populations play in the fearful minds of white Europeans. Shannon Winnubst sums this up in her writing titled Vampires, Anxieties, and Dreams, Race and Sex in the Contemporary United States. Dyer links the white ideal of masculinity to the figure of Christ, notably invoking race and Christianized religion. As signifiers for whiteness, Christ represents that incomprehensible fusion of the divine and the human. This links as well to the many descriptions of Jonathan Harker using a crucifix or a rosary against Count Dracula. Specifically in regards to the book Dracula, the three groups placed as monstrous here are, symbolically, the Roma, Slavic, and Jewish people. What the Roma and the Jewish people have in common as residents of European soil is the status of a diasporic people constantly persecuted by those outside their communities, thus thrusting them again and again into travel and forced residency on designated infertile lands, in partnership with pogroms, segregation, and trafficking, which are the local Europeans' way of purging their communities of the outsider who has invaded their sacred space. Even before nationalism became a tangible concept during the French Revolution, diasporic peoples seeking residency in Europe have been seen as a threat, especially if said people hold on to their cultural beliefs and practices and refuse to assimilate. At the time that Bram Stoker published Dracula, Great Britain was declining in its place as a dominating world power, both in trade and culture. After so long being comfortably used to being the dominating force of the world, Britain was feeling surpassed by the likes of Germany and the United States and, most ominously from a distance, Russia. Not yet the Soviet Union, and still years off from the Russian Revolution, the great power of Eastern Europe was still clawing its way into the hallowed halls of power, long shut off from them. The Western Europeans really did not know how to fathom their presence, nor their stark difference in culture. Various British authors took it upon themselves to travel to Russia and write about the peasants, as the Dr. Kenneth Percy Howard did in 1907. I must say that he is at once immoral and lazy to the core. He loves nothing better than to have just enough money or provisions in hand to allow him to have a good long drinking bout and a longer sleep. This was a writing about the peasants of rural Russia. This book is, unfortunately, on the more empathetic side of writings like this. At least it does mention with some understanding that the Russian peasantry lived in squalor due to the fact that hundreds of millions of citizens in the country were serfs, exploited, unprotected, and denied education. It was only just over 300 years before this that England itself was a serfdom, so you'd think they'd be a little more sympathetic. Technically, serfdom in Russia ended in 1861, but it didn't fully end in practice because former serfs became landless laborers, or sharecroppers, who had little to no freedom to travel. By the 1890s, Britain was slowly losing its grip on its colonies around the world, forcing them to see that you can only torture people for so long before it comes back to bite you. So surely it makes absolute sense that, from the perspective of a British author, the antagonist must be an Eastern European monster who smuggles himself into England for the sole purpose of draining the people there of their lifeblood. I mean, here's a wild idea. Maybe if you wouldn't be the planet's colonial supervillain, maybe you'd have nothing to worry about and people wouldn't hate you. Shocking, I know. Stephen D. Arata examines this phenomenon in his essay titled The Occidental Tourist, Dracula and the Anxiety of Reverse Colonization. Reverse colonization narratives are obsessed with the spectacle of the primitive. The savagery both repels and captivates. It makes them dangerous, but also deeply attractive. The Victorian era was a strange era for the world of medicine. For so long, people had relied on inefficient and frankly harmful practices in combination with their damnedest faith in God. Medicine itself was a field dominated by beliefs very spiritual in nature. After all, it was not too long before this that we had been relying on the system of the four humors, in which the body is made up of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which must always be in balance lest our health fail. The humors also worked with a spiritual element, believing that each humor represents a certain personality type, and each of us is more in tune with one humor over all the others. I don't know about you, but this plague sure does have my humors all out of balance. By the time the Victorian era rolls around, the humor system is falling slowly out of favor, but we are very much entrenched in what is known as the heroic age of medicine. Under this time period, heroic medicine sought to shock the body out of illness due to humor imbalance via rigorous sweating, bloodletting, and purging. What with his frail health in childhood, Bram Stoker would have been treated very frequently with bloodletting, either through leeches, a spring lancet, a phlegm, or a scarificator. I imagine the leeches might have had an impact on him. At the same time, doctors and advancements in medical research are slowly making headway into learning more about what really causes the illnesses that have plagued people for so long. But change is hard to face, and many people found themselves clinging to fables to explain what was happening to them. If a story or a monster can explain what's happening to your community now, why wait for science to explain it later? Incidents involving the discovery and subsequent destruction of vampires during this time were fairly common, many of which were actually cases of porphyria or sleeping sickness. Oftentimes it was catalepsy, which led people to be buried alive, so that later, when their bodies were dug up, they were not reasonably decomposed and had fresh blood on them, and thus must be a vampire. If the evidence is right there, you don't need a doctor. Alternately, it was not uncommon for bodies to literally leave their graves as a result of body snatching on the part of resurrection men or resurrectionists. People who were paid by surgeons in medical schools to dig up bodies and bring them to be dissected for medical study. See, it all comes full circle. Inextricably, people's fear of the movement of the dead was linked to medical advancement, but many were unaware of the connection. Clearly, it's vampires at work, and rituals of a spiritual nature can cleanse the community of the problem. Unsurprisingly, these solutions never really solved the issue. As medicine advanced more and more and slowly began to bring relief to people, communities relied less on the vampire myth as an immediate threat. However, a creature so powerful that has had a hold on the imaginations of people for centuries does not die so easily. It lives on to be reinvigorated by pop culture and media. The West has always needed to have some sort of accessible enemy. Whenever something is threatening to societal standards and structures, that something must be shirked of its abstract form and wrapped around something singular so it's easier to blame and kill. Maybe not with a stake or the sun, but more likely with the social power structures that we've built out of fear. As much as that structure wants everyone to believe that it's there to protect you from a foreign enemy, it is really only there to protect racial domination and subjugation and cis-heteronormativity. Fear has always been about power and powerlessness. Be the enemy not a vampire. The new enemy to take its place is likely a person of color, or a gay person, or a trans person, or a Jewish person. So it's no mystery why the Victorian era and vampires themselves are so linked to each other. More often than not, when we think of vampires, we do imagine the wet, dreary, moonlit streets of London, filled with lonely gentlemen and women, as an enshadowed, pale figure slinks through the darkness. Dracula set the standard for every vampire to follow in his silent footsteps. It's the standard for a harbinger of death of a colonial power, to take that power by the neck and repulse it, yet attract it as well. And we have Bram Stoker's many fears to thank for that. I'm gonna put my fangs back in now. I paid $80 for these suckers. I need to get some use out of them. And there's no trick-or-treaters this year, so I can't even make little kids think I'm a real vampire. What's even the point? Makes me really sad. I really like when I open the door and kids are like, oh, are you a real vampire? And I get to say, don't tell anyone. So, happy October, everyone. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. Wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't forget to be kind.